Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Mindset for Mars podcast. I'm Sorana Pascario, I'm your host. And with us today, we have a phenomenal guest. His name is Mauro Guillen. He's a professor at the Wharton School, and he wrote quite a lot of books, but his most recent one, which is called 2030, we get the exact title, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything. And his book is quite quite an amazing one. It's a Wall Street Journal bestseller right now, and I had the fortune to both see Mauro live talking about his book and to have read the book. Um, Mauro, please, first of all, tell me what inspired you to write this book, because it's quite recent, and it's interesting because you wrote it right before the pandemic. Um, so how did you get to it?
Yes, thank you so much, Sorana, for inviting me to your podcast. I started doing the research on for this book 7 years ago, and the reason was that as a professor and as a public speaker, I was making quite a few presentations about what would be, the expected changes in the world, in markets, also in politics, and so on and so forth. And I started to detect that the people listening to my presentations were getting a little bit anxious about the state of the world and how quickly it seemed to be changing. So that was 7 years ago. And about 3 years ago, I decided to write the book. And as you said, it came out in the midst of this pandemic. I have added to the book a postscript that analyzes how the pandemic is changing some of the predictions that I make in the book about what the world will look like in the year 2030. And I want to highlight for your followers something really important, which is that, look, this pandemic is unlike others in history in the sense that it accelerates trends. It accelerates the use of technology. It accelerates economic inequality. And as I can explain later, if you'd like me to, it also accelerates some of the population trends that we've seen in the world. So in other words, this pandemic just brings the future closer to us. We're going to be getting to that future earlier. And quite frankly, my only regret is that instead of calling the book 2030, I should have called it 2028, because that future is arriving much earlier than we thought.
That's so interesting. And we'll get to that later. I actually have a question about predicting and why 2030 and not later. But you were mentioning the trends. So you in your book you identify 8 trends that are kind of working together to create this future. Can you tell us what they are and just a little bit about each one of them?
Yeah, so in the book, I focus primarily on 3 types of trends. So the first set of trends has to do with population changes. And everything begins with the babies. We're having fewer babies as times go by. Everywhere in the world, not just in the rich countries, but also in Eastern Europe, also in Japan, in China, in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, of course, the number of children being born is very different, although that number is coming down over time. And so families in India, families in the Middle East, families in Sub-Saharan Africa have bigger families, more children than those in other parts of the world. So this is going to then create this transformation in terms of the centers of gravity of population in the world. And we're going to see that East Asia shrinks, whereas South Asia grows. And Europe, of course, shrinks, and Sub-Saharan Africa grows relative to the other parts of the world, right? So that's the first set of trends. The second set of trends has to do with emerging markets. And of course, before the pandemic, we already knew that emerging markets were growing faster than mature economies like Japan or Europe or the United States. The pandemic has accelerated that because, as you know, Europe and the United States haven't done a good job at controlling the pandemic. But other parts of the world, like East Asia and also New Zealand, they've done much better. So the East Asia Pacific region is going to continue growing this year, as opposed to us in the rest of the world. We're shrinking, right? Our economies are. So in other words, that future in which emerging markets were going to become the largest in the world is arriving faster. And so for the first time in recent memory, the US and Europe combined will not be the largest part of the world when it comes to consumer markets, and rather Asia will be. And that's a big change. And then the third set of trends that I analyze in the book have to do with technology. And of course, everyone is talking about technology. We're using technology right now to make this podcast possible. And technology is just obviously accelerating, but I don't think we've seen, the biggest changes that are right ahead of the curve here, which are primarily going to be involving, I think, artificial intelligence on the one hand, and the sharing economy, so sharing platforms. So again, I mean, no matter whether we focus the attention on population trends, on emerging markets, or on technology, those are the three types of trends that I cover in the book, there's massive change going on.
Okay, very interesting. And I want to get into more detail about each one of them a little later. But I want to ask, where we're still doing big picture. Which one was the most surprising of the trends for you?
Well, the one that I think surprised me the most in terms of trends that have gone on for a while, but they will, reach critical levels by the year 2030. I think is the different weight, and as a result of that, the different role that generations are going to have in the world. You see, by the year 2030, for the first time, in places like Japan or Europe or the United States, we're going to have more grandparents than grandchildren. Now, think about what that means, right? That means that, it's a very different world from the one in which you and I grew up. Because when we grew up and we had a family gathering, there were a few grandparents, right? There's 4 of them to each of us. But there were, maybe 10, maybe 15 grandchildren, right? But now the situation is such that grandparents are living longer. So those 4 grandparents are more likely to stay alive for a longer period of time. And at the same time, there are fewer grandchildren, right? And this means that for the first time in many, many decades, the largest generation won't be the younger generation. It will be the older generation. So the people above the age of 60 are going to become, by the year 2030, the biggest consumer market in the world. And that is a game changer because, just to give you one quick example, remember, companies always have the younger consumer in mind. Think about clothing companies, think about personal care products companies, think about even durable goods like household appliances. They always have younger consumers in mind. But I think that's about to change, because once companies realize that the largest segment will be the population above age 60, then they're going to start thinking more in terms of what are the needs and the preferences of that group.
Absolutely, and that's very important for entrepreneurs to think, how to start catering to those populations. I mean, it was actually very interesting when reading your book. I was thinking, wow, so the kinds of lifestyle products that we're going to see are going to be completely different because people at age 60, and I think you talk about something very important, is that the type of lifestyle that people age 60 are going to have in 2030 is very different from 20 years ago, or even from now. They have different purchasing power, they have better health, they have very different consumer preferences. So it's going to completely change the way entrepreneurs are going to look at how to build their products and their services. I wanted to ask you, I don't want this to be necessarily a controversial question, but what was the scariest trend? Because I'll tell you afterwards which one it was for me.
Well, in terms of the scariest trends, I think all of them, can be read as a threat, right? But of course, what I try to do in the book is to say that every single of them can be turned into an opportunity. I think, quite frankly, from my own personal point of view, the one that represents the biggest threat is our continuing inability to transform cities, right? Cities, as you know, are growing. And the problem with cities is very easy to summarize with just 3 quick numbers. Cities occupy 1% of the land in the world. They're home to about 55% of the population, and that's growing. But the third number is the one that matters. 80% of the carbon emissions in the world originate from cities. So 1% of the land, 80% of the carbon emissions. So in other words, if you believe, as I do, that, or if your listeners believe, as I do, that climate change is for real and that human activity has a lot to do with it, then there's no solution to the problem of climate change unless we somehow, transform our cities so that they are not as, environmentally unfriendly as they are right now. And that's the key challenge, I think, for the next few years in terms of this really important issue, which is climate change.
Okay, so essentially climate change is, because now it seems that climate change seems to be the kind of the biggest focus. For example, the next edition of TED Talks is essentially focused on climate change. Prince William just launched a very interesting prize called the Earthshot, and they're looking at the next decade as the decade that is critical for for us to actually do something about climate change, because after 2030, it's going to reach a tipping point. Would you like to, go into more detail about this trend and how we can, prevent it, what can be done about it, and how it's going to affect us? Mauro, I can't hear you.
I think there are three things that we need to keep in mind for tackling the problem of climate change. So let me make three very quick points about it. The first is that we have very little collaboration right now among governments in the world. As you know, nobody's talking to anybody. We have all of these political leaders in various parts of the world, which are clearly not interested in getting together and talking about it. So that's one thing that we need. A second thing, of course, is we need more efforts at arriving at technological breakthroughs in terms of energy and energy sources in the world. And of course, we're working very hard. But the third point is the one that I really care about. And it's the one that I describe in the book in more detail, which is that as consumers, people are like ourselves, we can do a lot of things to try to help the world cope with the problem of climate change. And the reason for that is that we waste so much. We waste so much food. We waste so many clothes. We waste so many things that we purchase and that therefore consume natural resources, and many of them are highly polluting because you need energy in order to make them. And I think that's where the sharing economy comes. Yes, we've seen the beginnings of the sharing economy over the last 10 years with Uber, with Didi, with Airbnb, but I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think we're going to see more sharing economy in the sense of helping us overcome this pattern of wasteful overconsumption that we're having in the world. And I think, increasingly, we are going to be using some of these platforms on our phones to try to see if we can waste less food, or if we don't have to, purchase so many clothes. In other words, I think sharing through these digital platforms is going to go a long way in terms of helping the world cope with climate change. So again, I'm not discounting the role that governments have to play. I am not discounting the importance of arriving at technological breakthroughs when it comes to energy sources. But I think as consumers, we also need to change, and technology in the form of sharing platforms can play a big role.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is one, very important is taking personal responsibility. So each person's micro decisions, micro choices every day can make a difference, but also the impact of technology. So it's very interesting because technology is one of your trends, but it seems also to be one of the potential saviors. Let's say of our future. Do you wanna talk more about technology in general?
Well, technology in general, of course, is a big topic, and I know that you and your listeners are very interested in space exploration.
Yeah.
So I do have one reference in the book about that endeavor. I believe that in addition to digital platforms, in addition to artificial intelligence, there's another technology that I think will change quite a few things moving forward, and that's 3D printing. 3D printing has the potential of helping us be less wasteful, and also the potential of decentralizing production, right? Because instead of having a big factory that produces to stock, what we have is essentially people printing out what they need, people or companies, of course, locally at a 3D printer. And this is, I think, potentially something that will also help with climate change. But in terms of space exploration, think about what would it take to colonize the moon or to establish a base there, or Mars, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that will be important is for the humans who establish such colonies to be able to use local resources to produce some of the things that they need, so that we don't have to transport them from Earth, right? And I think 3D printing will come handy because you may be able to find the raw material that you need to run a 3D printer, and then you might be able to essentially print certain things that you may need, not only spare parts, but also other kinds of useful utensils. So that's the one connection that I make in the book about, some of these most exciting technologies that are under development now, and the potential for space exploration. So I do believe that, that future in which we're going to have a permanent colony on a heavenly body other than Earth is approaching. And again, there are certain technologies that will help us get there.
That's very cool. And actually, I want to ask you a little bit more about this, about space exploration. You have a very beautiful story in your book about Easter Island, and the fact that Easter Island is a very small ecosystem with very limited resources, and you tell how initially it was believed that it declined because its inhabitants mismanaged resources and didn't know how to keep going, and had a kind of a failed civilization. But it was later discovered that actually they had to do with very little, and they used their resources very imaginatively. And you use that as a metaphor for how we are going to have to manage in the future, when population is growing, cities are growing, and because of climate change, we have less resources. But, talking about space exploration, I was thinking, how about if that's actually not true? What if, we start colonizing space, and we essentially expand our resources because we start mining asteroids, or, the moon or Mars or whatever, in the distant future. Or even there's a very interesting idea, and I think Jeff Bezos is the biggest proponent of it, is that we build an infrastructure. And again, this is quite the distant future, but I think it's interesting to think about it. It's building an infrastructure that will allow us to take a lot of the heavy industry or other types of pollutants out into space, rather than have them on Earth.
Yes, so there are, of course, many possibilities regarding, all of those scenarios that you have outlined. What I think is, clearly the case is the following, right? Which is that some people believe that at this point, spending resources and money on space exploration is, perhaps wasteful because, there are other problems and there are other resources that we could develop here on Earth. And I always have two responses to that, right? Because I don't agree with it. The first one is that, look, the quest for sending a man to the moon resulted in one of the biggest technological leaps that we've ever seen, right? Because so many different technologies had to be developed with the purpose of essentially, being able to successfully stage a moon landing. And then, of course, to have the human beings return safely to Earth. So that's one big benefit, right? I mean, when a big agency such as NASA, frequently in collaboration with so many other organizations, both private and public, when they set as a goal something like the moon landings, they are essentially then developing technologies that years later we see how they are making it their way into many of the products that we have today, right? And that's extremely important. And the second point that I would like to mention is that I think the Easter Island example is very telling, right? So I think interesting thing about Easter Island is not so much that it collapsed, right? Which is the question that so many previous writers have tried to answer. Why did it collapse? I think the more interesting question is how come that it lasted so long, right? Because the island, I've been there twice, is so tiny. I mean, it's really tiny. And if it ever sustained tens of thousands of people, that's a remarkable miracle, right? And especially if they managed to do that over several hundred years. Now, they were using, relatively primitive technologies all along. But one should say that what is really important is that I think they failed at one, very important, in one very important aspect, which is that they lost interest in exploring the world beyond their island, right? They could have done that, for example, even if they didn't, want to reach other shores, but just to develop marine resources, for instance, right? Because they run into trouble because a lot of the fish banks close to the island were over harvested, and therefore that source of protein disappeared. But they could have been a little bit more curious. And that's why I think space exploration is important, because it enables us not only to develop new technologies, but also to play to this innate tendency that we have as human beings, which is to be curious about what lies beyond, right? What is, around the corner from our familiar environment. So I think that for humankind, I think it's extremely important to pursue space exploration, even if we couldn't find any minerals on asteroids, right? Which, as you mentioned, that is increasingly becoming a possibility. Even if we couldn't colonize, the moon or Mars. But just the fact that we would be stepping out of our comfort zone and we would be pursuing that dream of finding what is beyond the part of the world that we know so well, the part of the universe that we know so well, then I think that's all for good.
Oh, that's great. And actually, that's a very good segue into, one of basically the final chapter of your book, in which you offer tips and tricks on how to manage this future that can, bring quite a lot of anxiety, and that's lateral thinking. And you're talking about curiosity and about exploration. So, do you want to expand a bit on that?
Yes, absolutely. So in the concluding chapter of the book, what I say is, look, what's going on right now is massive change, and that necessarily produces a lot of uncertainty. But we shouldn't freeze when we are confronted by uncertainty. We should continue to make decisions about our personal lives, about our jobs. Organizations should continue to make decisions, and countries. But there are two golden rules that I think need to be observed. So in the book, I lay them out in terms of 7 basic principles. But now, just for the benefit of time, let me just mention that there are 2 basic rules, right? The first one is that one shouldn't think, when there is so much change, that it is possible to return to the situation where we started. So before the pandemic, or 20 years ago, or the year we were born. And as you know, there's many politicians that promise you just that. Oh, I will bring back the good old days, right? And what I try to persuade people with my book is, in the book, in the concluding chapter in particular, is you have to, reject that way of thinking. Going back is not possible. Turning the clock back, doesn't work. You need to adapt to the new situation. You need to change your mindset. That's the first golden rule. And the second is that you have to avoid the 2 extremes of one extreme is not making any decisions because you are overwhelmed by the uncertainty. And the other extreme is to change everything, right? Because in response to all of that change, then let me just change everything, right? So you switch jobs, you get divorced, you move to a different country, you, instead of being an early riser, you start working into the hours of the night, and so on and so forth. No, I think that's also wrong, right? But you certainly have to make decisions. And for me, the important thing is, do not make any decisions when there's so much uncertainty, decisions that are irreversible. So no matter what decisions you make, you always need to leave the door behind you open. Don't close the door behind you, right? Keep your options open. Make sure that if today you decide on a course of action, that you can engage in the so-called course correction tomorrow, or a week later, or a month later. So don't make any irreversible decisions. Allow yourself for the opportunity to, switch course, right, as you go. Because when there's so much uncertainty, it's very difficult to anticipate all of the future states of the world.
That's very true. You were saying, and this plays exactly into one of the points that I wanted to make. You were talking about politicians promising things are going to go back to the way they were, and how that's impossible. And I was asking you about what was the scariest trend for you, and I think this is something that we've seen is with the fact that the focus of the world is changing. I mean, for me personally, that created anxiety, I have to admit. The idea that the Western world is not going to be the focus anymore. How much immigration is going to change the way the world looks. And I think there's a lot of politicians that are playing into those fears by creating isolationism, by promising that, hey, we're going to protect you from those trends.
Yeah.
What do you think about this?
Well, as you can imagine, I think that that's perhaps an even bigger threat than we have right now, compared to some of the other kinds of challenges that we've been talking about. Yeah, population aging is a threat. Yes, climate change is a threat, all of these things. But I think by comparison, some of the biggest problems that we have right now is, as you're saying, is that we have certain kinds of political leaders in the world, whom I would, describe as being some combination of nationalistic, populist, and very protectionist. In some cases, also xenophobic, but not always, right? And that's a terrible combination, right? Because I think, populism, which essentially denies science and denies evidence, right? And that essentially, makes direct appeals to the people, especially by promising them that everything will be okay, right? With very simple, solutions or very simple fixes. And most of the time when people, promise you an easy fix for a complex problem, he or she is a fraudster, right? I mean, there's no such thing as a simple solution to a complex problem, right? So climate change is a complex problem. Inequality is a complex problem. All of these things are very complex problems, and they normally require complex solutions. I mean, it's very rare that you can come up with a silver bullet, with the easy thing that will fix all of those big issues in the world. So I'm completely in agreement with you. This is one of the most difficult issues that we have right now. And unfortunately, there's way too many countries in the world right now on all 5 continents, which are being led by politicians who are either nationalistic or protectionist or populist, or some combination thereof.
What are the opportunities in immigration? Because I think this is something that a lot of people are not aware of. How much immigration actually, what a beneficial trend it really is.
Yes, so of course I'm biased in the sense that I am an immigrant myself. So I moved from Spain to the United States. But I think, I can also be objective. And look, most of the evidence about immigration indicates that it tends to be beneficial to the host country. For starters, immigrants tend to be younger than the population in the countries where they go to. And so it helps rebalance, the age structure, right? But also immigrants tend to be entrepreneurs. So at the low end of things, we see a lot of immigrants engaged in, small mom and pop businesses like restaurants, like dry cleaners, like, small stores, and so on and so forth. But then in addition to that, if you take a look at Europe, you take a look at the United States, there are so many immigrants who have founded some of the most amazing companies, right? Google, Tesla, right? I mean, the list is endless, right? And this happens in Europe as well. So I think we need to abandon that mindset in which immigration is something perhaps to be tolerated, but not something to be encouraged. And we need to really understand all of the benefits that it brings. And, I'm optimistic about this one because, of course, right now we're at a low point in the sense that a lot of political attitudes have shifted against immigration. But, attitudes towards immigration go in cycles, right? And every 20 or 30 years, the tide moves in one direction or the other. So I'm hoping that it won't be, too long before we see again political leaders, but also public opinion more broadly, turn, back to a more favorable view of immigration.
Okay. There's a couple of more trends in your book that I would like um, to go in depth about because they're trends that we don't necessarily think about. Obviously the technology and climate change are they're kind of top of mind, but the other ones aren't necessarily. And one of them is women. You have a very interestingly titled chapter in your book that says second sex no more question mark. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so the important part is the question mark. Because I want to make it very clear from the beginning that in every country in the world, you have women who are doing increasingly better. They're getting an education, or they're entrepreneurs. They're seeing their careers, they're seeing their opportunities expand. But also in every country in the world, there's also another, subset of women who are not doing that well, right? But of course, on average, women are doing much better than before. Look, here in the United States, as we speak, in 41% of households that have both a man and a woman, either because they're spouses or because they are partners, the woman makes more money than the man, in 41% of them. And the projection is that by the year 2030, more than half of them. And that's, of course, because women now can access more opportunities in education and then with their careers and their jobs. There's still discrimination. There's no question about it. More broadly in the world, by the year 2030, more than half of the net worth will be owned by women. And this is going to change quite a few things, right? And I always try to remind people that the biggest difference when it comes to the behavior of men and women has to do with our attitudes towards risk-taking, with women on average being more risk-averse than men. And that essentially translates into all sorts of consequences for consumer markets, for savings, for investing, also for politics, eventually, and perhaps also for philanthropy, what in the United States, in the United Kingdom, you call charity, right? So I think there's going to be, quite a few revolutionary changes in the world because women now have more opportunities. And although not all women participate yet in those opportunities, things are changing very fast. And by the way, there's a feedback loop here, because it is precisely all of these changes that I've been talking about with the opportunities available to women, which is also driving the fertility rate, the number of babies down, right? And so all of these changes that I've been talking about, they all interact with one another. And that's why it's so important to think laterally, look for the connections, connecting the dots across all of the different trends.
Yeah, and you were talking about the fact that interestingly, this pandemic is accelerating all of these trends, including the fact that because of uncertainty, women are having even fewer babies, and they're postponing this, and they're probably becoming even more risk averse. So it's very interesting how everything is an ecosystem. You can't look at any one trend, and that actually leads me to my next question, and that is, for those who want to do their own forecasting. Obviously you provided an amazing tool for us. I mean, your book is fantastic. I recommend it to everybody who wants to have a tool for looking into the future, a little time machine. But if we were to, learn how to do it ourselves, what should we look at? I mean, obviously these are trends. You already gave us kind of the building blocks of forecasting. What are the big trends? What should we look at in order to be able to, to forecast the future when we look, not just at 2030, but further than that?
Well, I would say three things, and this is a terrific question, and thank you, of course, for your kind words about the book. The first is you need to decide what is your methodology, right, for anticipating the future. So in the book, I used a very simple two-step method, which was, let me first follow the babies. And step number two was, let me follow the money. Let me try to understand how much money those babies are going to have in their pockets once they grow up in different parts of the world. And that's essentially my methodology, right?
Mhm.
Now, second step is you have to choose a time horizon that makes sense. So with the methodology that I just explained, I think it's impossible to make forecasts 100 years down the road, right? Because so many things could change. But 10 years, I feel very confident. Why? Well, because the babies who are being born today will be younger, young people in the year 2030. And, we can also learn about the babies that were born 10 years ago or the babies that were born 20 years ago. So following the babies, following the population trends gives me a view into the future that can be very valuable. As long as you don't have a 50 or a 100-year time horizon. I think 10 years is about right. Okay, so you have to choose a time horizon that makes sense given the methodology that you're using, right? And then the third step, I think, is really simple. Look, the future awaiting us is not going to be created by just one trend. It's going to be the result of many things, right? So it's inherently multidimensional. So we're all, far better, versed in certain kinds of topics than in others. We all specialize, right? To begin with, if you go to college, you major or you focus your studies on one subject area. And so I think it's extremely important, if you want to understand what the future may look like, to think outside of your comfort zone, to gather evidence and read about what's going on in other areas, in other fields. And let me give you what my method is for that. For the last few years, I've forced myself, to spend maybe 10 or 15 minutes every night before I go to bed. I force myself to read a short piece that I find on my phone, surfing the web, on a topic about which I know very little. So I have that now as a habit. And it's extremely good because I'm learning about things that I never thought, might be relevant to what I do, right? And so one day it can be about archaeology in some part of the world. Another day it can be about space exploration. And yet another day it could be, let's say, about biodiversity in some part of the world. And those are topics that are, I'm not a specialist, I'm not an expert in any of those topics. But learning more about them, even at that superficial level, which is, 15 minutes every night, I read about a different topic. Over time, it makes a big difference in my thinking. And it also exercises my mind to look for the, connections, the lateral connections. And that's extremely important if you're trying to understand the future. Because you see, many futurists, what they say is, oh, I know what's going to happen in the world because look, this is what's going on. And they mention one thing. And quite frankly, I don't think that's a serious approach to understanding the future.
That's fantastic, and that actually leads me to my last question. You're a professor, you're an educator, and you just mentioned a very interesting and useful habit that you developed. What would be your, let's say, piece of advice about how to educate ourselves for the future? How do we stay relevant? What's the education that we're going to require in order to manage what's coming for us?
Well, look, let me answer in the following way, which is one of the, I think, most important messages in the book. We have been raised in a way that I think is self-defeating, given the amount of change that is going on in the world. We were told since the moment we were little and we started to have conversations that first you learned for 20 years or so, right? And then you move on to working, right? That was the next stage in life. And lastly, you would retire, right? And if you remember, the notion that life proceeds in stages, learning, working, and then enjoying retirement, is a 19th century idea, right? It was invented in Germany, of all places. Bismarck, proposed, hey, people should first learn, so we should make schooling compulsory, and then people should work, and then if they work, the state will give them a pension at the end. Now, obviously, he was very smart because average life expectancy in Germany 150 years ago was like maybe 47, 48 years, right? Mm-hmm. So very few people actually made it to retirement age. But today, a 60-year-old or a 65-year-old on average in Europe, in the United States, may live another 25 years or even 30 years. And if you're a woman, even longer than that. That's another lifetime. Think about it. 25 years or 30 years is another lifetime. So I think the single most important thing I would tell your listeners is start thinking that you need to be learning throughout your life, right? Start thinking that, you should not be longing for retirement. If you're longing for retirement, that means you don't like your job right now, okay? So maybe you should reinvent yourself. Maybe you should pursue something else. Because come on, if you turn 60 or you turn 65 and you retire, what are you going to do with 30 years worth of, life, right? Beyond that age? Are you going to just retire, or would it be better for you to pursue other dreams, other careers, to acquire new knowledge, and then maybe to apply, launch your own business, or maybe work part-time, in the gig economy? That, I think, is the single most important thing that I would like to convey to your listeners, that we need to reinvent the way we live our lives in the wake of all of these changes. And of course, we need employers and we need governments to also see that we need to abandon this 19th century notion about how life happens, okay? Human life and the different stages that we go through.
Amazing. Mauro, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation, really, really insightful. Thank you again so much for joining us, and I really look forward to your next book.
All right. Thank you so much.
2040.
Exactly.
All right. Take care.